It's a pleasure to be here again. I was reminding Martin we worked together in, wait for it, 1970. So I think we're probably the longest lived SPRU people here and in SPRU, actually. And it's a great pleasure to be back. And as some of you know, I'm an associate of SPRU and will be retiring from Open University later this year, and I might be around. This is a threat. I might be around more often. The second point I want to make, and it's very much in keeping with the spirit of what Martin said, he referred to the Global Value Chains group, which we ran at the IDS together with Gary Giraffe in the US. And whatever name appropriates any part of the story is a misrepresentation. The development of the Global Value Chains framework, as in most work, is a collective experience, and particularly people appropriate it in particular circumstances. But I want to try and help us to understand what is really a collective enterprise and a collective endeavor, and I gather that's some of the discussion we'll have afterwards. Is that right, Martin? Yeah. A lot of you know more about this topic than I am, and I'll tell you why I've done it. How do I get to the next slide? Okay, great. So how many people in the last 3 or 6 months have used the words global value chains in anything they've written? Okay, you're not unique. I looked at Google on the 29th of January. How many hits are there on global value chains? On value chains, there were 37.8 million listings. On global value chains, 15.8 million listings. So I thought I'd refine that a bit and go to Google Scholar, and the numbers declined, but again to really quite substantial numbers. I would like to, and why I've got involved in this is, there was a time when global value chains had a rather specific meaning, or the discussion on the global value chains had a rather specific meaning. It's now the flavor of the month. And everybody talks about everything they're doing as global value chains because that's where the money lies, and that's the topic. I was at a meeting between the World Bank and the ILO a few years ago when there was a talk of having a large funded program on global value chains. The ILO group came along, they were asked to present what they'd done on global value chains, and they presented exactly the same work which they presented as enterprise studies 2 years before, and all they did was they changed the heading to global value chains. And it's because of this very loose use of the phrase global value chains, and because I was asked to write a chapter for a handbook of industrial development on global value chains, and when I read the literature, I was struck by how widely this concept or the phrase is used, and how poorly informed much of the literature which mentions value chains is of the analytic underpinnings of global value chain theory. So again, people in this room for what I'm saying is not new at all. And there'll be people in this room who know much more about lots of the issues I'm going to talk about than I do. So I'm really presenting this as a collective endeavor to try and help us reinforce and be a little more concise and careful about our use of value chains. And in particular, and this is what I hope is the main contribution, to make the distinction between the value chain framework as a heuristic framework and the value chain framework as an analytical framework. And I think there's quite an important distinction between these two sets of work. Okay, so here's one picture of a global value chain, the 787 Dreamliner, and you can see that parts come from all over the world. You can't see all the different countries here, but essentially this is a very large assembly program with a series of subcomponents drawn with high levels of competence from different parts of the world and different suppliers. Here's another value chain. This is a more conventional one. This is the text apparel global value chain, and it goes through the various links in the chain, and each of the links have a series of activities in it. And you will have seen this value chain represented everywhere. The value chains can be extremely complex. So here's the story of, I don't know how many of you know this story, Zing and Detert on the iPhone 4. How many people have got an iPhone 4? Sells in the US for about $400, exported from China for $175, value added in China, It's called Made in China, if you look at the back of it. Value added in China is $6.50. And this is one of the classic studies of why it's important in looking at international trade to break open a product like this. Now, it's actually more complicated than this. In reality, and this isn't in the literature, the value added in China is much more than $6.50 because many of the components which are brought from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Germany are in themselves partly processed in China. So this is just the first round of a very thin value added in a made in China product. But actually, if you could trace back the provenance of all the components and the sub-assemblies in the iPhone, you'd probably find that that $6.50 is a significant underestimate. And this creates all sorts of problems for the measurement of world trade, which I think I see Peter's in this room, and their trade economists are eventually beginning to see the significance of global value chains. There is massive double counting in global trade of the value of world trade, because the value of world trade in iPhones, in trade statistics, includes the final iPhone sold, but the value of trade also includes the components which are drawn from around the world. And the WTO and the bank and the OECD have begun to get on top of this topic, and their estimate is that of the $19 trillion of global trade in 2010, 28%, $5 trillion, was double counted. That is, global trade which both included the iPhone itself as well as the components in the iPhone. So we're beginning to understand now, with the complexity of globalization, that the significance of breaking open these products which are produced and assembled all over the world has implications across a range of areas, which I'm going to talk about, some of them, including our measurement of international trade, GDP, and value added, the difference between gross and net value added, for example. So with that background, let's go to a widely used definition. Actually, it's one which I wrote as it happens, but there are many like it, and it's very simple. The value chain describes the full range of activities which are required to bring a product or service from conception through the different phases of production, involving a combination of physical transformation of inputs and various producer services, delivery to final consumers, and final disposal after use. And this last one here is something which, as we now know, because of the environmental issues, is becoming increasingly important, and much of the discussion of value chains tends to stop at final consumption. So this is a general picture, but it enables us to draw the sorts of chains. I showed you the parallel value chain earlier on. My concern with a definition like this, which is essentially a heuristic definition, it tells you what something looks like, is that it doesn't tell us who coordinates this chain. It doesn't tell us the power relations in this coordination, who wields the stick, who determines who can enter, who can do what in the chain, and how they do it. It doesn't tell us anything about the geography of where these things are being done. It doesn't tell us anything about the distribution of gains in these chains, and nor does it tell us anything about the environment. So what I now want to do is to depart from essentially what is a heuristic definition, which can be shown in something like that, to talk about the global value chains framework, which begins to unravel the way in which these chains are coordinated, the ways in which they're governed, where activities occur, who gains from these activities, and what the impact on the environment is. And from the SPRU point of view, and very importantly, and a neglected area in value chain research, is the whole question of innovation. Because to my knowledge, almost no one has looked at, people like Hubert Schmitz and his student is now in Globelics in Denmark, have begun to look at the value chain of innovation, but no one has yet looked at the role of innovation in global value chains, which I think is a very important issue, and perhaps we can come back to. Okay, so let's talk now about the origins of the value chain framework. There are multiple origins to this framework. I'm going to distinguish between the origins before 1994, when the key contribution was made, and the discussion and the development of the value chain framework after 1994. I'm going to talk about these different origins as if they were distinct and not interrelated, but of course there was enormous cross-fertilization between them. So it begins with Adam Smith and the division of labor. Essentially, as you know, Adam Smith argued that, particularly with the extent of the market, it was possible to specialize. You specialized in a variety of ways, including the development of a capital goods industry. And since the value chain is all around specialization and the division of labor within the chain, that's an important building block. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a school in France which looked at what they called the filière, which means the thread, and looked at the thread of production in the agricultural sector in France. It was essentially a national level study aiming to chart, as I've said, heuristically, what the various stages of production were in the production and consumption of agricultural goods. Michael Porter makes a big contribution in 1985. Confusingly, he refers to what we now call the value chain as the value system, and Porter graphically gives us something like that apparel value chain, and essentially talks about it again in a heuristic way. He's just drawing our attention to the fact that there's an increasing division of labor, and that tasks which were formerly conducted within the enterprise as a whole are now conducted in rather complex ways by different parties. Womack and Jones then call the value system the value stream, but essentially they're both talking about value chains. Now, Norman Girvan and an important stream of development studies, surfaces in the South African phrase beneficiation, very confusing, focused on the process of value accretion in the commodity sector. And they argued from the development perspective that really what ought to happen is the developing countries ought to move up the value chain, this is a common use of the word, away from just extracting materials from out of the ground to begin to process the materials. And in the madness of current South African industrial policy, because you have copper under the ground, you should be making electric motors, because you must add value to your raw materials, and you should be able to command the resource rents and use them across the whole of this chain. But this strand of adding value to commodities and moving up the chain is an important part of the story, particularly in agricultural value chains. Then we begin to move in the 1980s with Wallerstein and Origi to beginning to think about the value chain as a way of understanding the global division of incomes. And Wallerstein and Origi and others spoke about the core and the periphery, and how the core would stop the periphery from moving up to higher incomes. And that was essentially around the division of labor in globally traded products. And some of you might know the work of Frobel, Henrichs, and Cray, the first real empirical study in the 1970s of the global value chain in apparel, where they looked at the German apparel industry and showed how increasingly parts of the production process were being shipped out to North Africa. Okay, so we then get to 1994, and here the key contribution, really the important name in value chain thinking, is Gary Giraffy. Gary Giraffy feeds off Wallerstein and world systems theory, and he says the critical thing about these global chains is that they have power relations in. These chains need to be coordinated, and coordination is essentially a power relationship, and they are territorial, that is, they cross national boundaries. And Giraffy refers to this as the global commodity chains, and it really is a structural shift and the beginning of an analytical perspective, because he begins to talk more than just around what happens where. He tells us how it happens and who controls that. In 1979, we bring Gary over to the IDS, and the global value chains framework is created. Now, I know people talk about value chains which have nothing to do with the Sussex American link. I'm talking about the global value chains theoretical framework. Essentially, it's a construction of this group from 1999. And that said, look, commodities is such an ambiguous phrase. We refer to commodities often as an agricultural product or as a mineral, but really a commodity is something without barriers to entry. Anything which has no barrier to entry is essentially a commodity and is subject to the laws of intense competition, and hence the sweeping away of rents. And because this word commodity is used so in these dual forms, both as a physical representation of an agricultural product or mineral and to define something which doesn't really have any rents, we should move away from the phrase commodity. Secondly, once we move away from, once we accept that commodities are things which don't embody rents, that then gives us an entry into thinking about innovation streams as really sources of rent and the appropriation of rents. So the value becomes a very important part of that story, and it also helps us, the Sussex group, think about, and I'll come back to this later on, upgrading and productivity growth in new and different ways. So this group from 1999, still working incidentally, although the Sussex group seems to have dropped out of it, made this really important contribution. Building on Guerrefi's idea of power and governance, moves the debate away from, moves the debate more into areas of rent and distribution and upgrading. And there's no conflict between these different schools. Everybody in this area has now a large agreement in what is understood by global value chains. The Sussex group, and I'm thinking of Hubert and John, were particularly, Humphrey, Hubert and John Humphrey, were particularly important in partnerships. They also made the point that having production competences doesn't automatically give you an effective market presence. You need to understand how producers fit into global markets, and that will determine the extent of rents in the chain and who might appropriate the rents. And just as a footnote, for example, I'm doing a large report for the African Export-Import Bank, and they've asked us to look at clusters and supply chains as a determinant of African competitiveness. And we've gone back to them and said, getting supply right is only part of the story. How do producers insert themselves in markets, and what are the implications of being inserted in different markets on your capacity to upgrade and on the distribution of returns within the chain? Global production networks is a form of branding, comes out of Manchester, out of economic geography. Good global production work is essentially the same as good global value chain work. Good global value chain work interfaces with global production networks. The key point which global GPN framework adds is the idea of embeddedness. And the fact that, and I'll talk about it later on, that producers have social roots. So ownership becomes important, clustering activities become important, but essentially much of the distinction between GPN and GVC is essentially noise of personal appropriation. I just want to add one final part, and this interfaces with the work which Matthias is doing, a very interesting set of work which I think now represents the state of the art, and Gerefi and others are working on, the ex-Sussex people, is the Capturing the Gains Network. And this is a group of researchers working together with stakeholders who've been trying to identify under what circumstances you get economic efficiency and social efficiency aligning. You'll know from the work of Pfeffer and others in the US that there was an argument about good work practices being an important component of effective production. This group is a little more skeptical and says good working practice might be an effective form of efficient production in the long term, but that isn't always the case. And what do we mean by economic efficiency? What do we mean by social efficiency? So, Martin, at this stage, I'd like to move on to the analytical constituents of global value chains, unless you want to just break a bit and talk about this historiography and whether this captures the evolution of thinking of value chains. It just stops me being too didactic.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
There was a period in which there was something called the United Nations Organization on Transnational Corporations, the study of transnational corporations.
UNCTC, yeah.
And they were particularly interested in transfer price problems and the variety of issues surrounding that as representing exploitation or power type relationships. How would this map in? It's a different framework, of course, but it seems to have bear some relation to this.
Absolutely. Everybody's familiar with transfer pricing, right? Norman Govan, the name I mentioned earlier on, worked with the UNCTC, and the UNCTC really, to some extent, comes out of work done very early on in Sussex by Constantine Weitzers in the 1970s, which was essentially around transfer pricing, Robin Murray, names like that. But you're absolutely right, because the capacity to shift profits around the world is essentially a function of trade within value chains, and often trade within firms as well. So, yes, it's an important part.
Unless people have questions specifically on where Rafi has so far been, I would be inclined to roll on, Rafi, but
Okay.
There was a...
Okay, otherwise we'll run out of time.
Keep rolling.
We'll run out of time anyway, won't we? Okay, so I now want to, I've got two things I want to, I've done perhaps longer on this than I ought to. I would like to talk about 6 of the analytical underpinnings of global value chains, which I think help us to understand its power as an analytical tool and what its analytical roots are. And then I'd like to talk about where value chains are going, which is much more debatable at the end. So, let me rush through. Okay. Okay. Now, I think the first point about global value chains is the understanding why they've become important was this transition around the Fiore and Sable referred to it as the second industrial divide. The recognition from the 1970s onwards that really the market for homogeneous, unbranded, undifferentiated, large-scale, mass-produced products was being undermined, and that markets in the rich countries were becoming increasingly demanding of differentiation and innovation. And that's very important because the fragmentation and the volatility of final markets requires the customization of product and smaller batches, greater variety, greater quality. And very importantly, to achieve variety, quality, and customization requires a move away from arm's length relationships in trade along the value chain to a much closer discourse between the various parts of the chain. So I'll give you a good example, because a lot of the process implications of the global value chain were developed by Toyota in the 1970s and 1980s with the Toyota production system. One of Toyota's key attributes was quality and variety in the market. In order to get quality and variety in the market, they had to move away from large batch production to small batch production, just-in-time production. Just-in-time production doesn't work with quality at the end of production. It requires quality at source. And in order for Toyota to achieve these capabilities in a marketplace, it had to develop very close and ongoing relationships with its suppliers. So understanding how the fragmentation of market and the need for customized and small batch production in final products eats away at the capacity to have arm's length relationships in the chain. The greater the degree of specificity and variety in the final market, the less likely that arm's length relationships in the chains will operate. So, point number one. Point number two, and here we see an event which begins in the 1970s and 1980s. Again, Toyota becomes very important in this. In the 1970s, when the Japanese auto industry was so much more superior than the US automobile industry, the US firms were buying in less than 35% of their components from suppliers, and Toyota and Nissan were buying in 55-60% of their components from suppliers. And that then gave vent to a series of restructuring in large firms in the world, which is that firms should focus on the areas of core competences, which were unique to the firm, which were difficult to copy, and had value in the marketplace. In other words, they should try and move into areas where there were barriers to entry, where they could generate an appropriate rents. And as a consequence of the focus on core competences was outsourcing, and initially the outsourcing was done to suppliers who were nearby, but increasingly as communication costs fell, as competences grew in Asia particularly, nearsourcing became offshoring. So the first part of the value chain, analytical motor, if you like, is around the need to cope with fragmented and differentiating markets, volatile markets. The second one is in order to get there, and increasingly knowledge-intensive chains, firms need to focus on their core competences. And of course, these core competences are dynamic, so that the capability demand is not just to focus on core competences, but to make sure you have the capacity to do this on an ongoing and dynamic basis. And this is where trade statistics aren't very helpful. The overall result of this focus on core competences is that firms and countries increasingly specialize in capabilities, not in products. And the problem for those of us who are measuring international trade is that international trade is measured as final products, an iPhone 4, whereas, as you saw, the trade in the iPhone is in assembly capabilities, in screen capabilities, and a variety of other things. So, good for China, of course, this outsourcing, because China then became the factory of the world, and while it only added $6.50 in value to the iPhone 4, the values in the iPhone 5 are considerably greater because Chinese firms have become so much more capable. Okay, now, once we see that core competences and outsourcing are an important part of the story, the question is then one of governance. We have very, very complex change with activities occurring all over the world. How are they to be coordinated? Now, Geraghty initially said that we can distinguish two key types of governance and coordination. There are those sectors where the governors were the final buyers, Nike, and there are those sectors which are technology intensive, where the primary drivers of governance were at the bottom of the chain, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, General Motors, Toyota, who drove the chain from the bottom up rather than the top down. We've become a bit skeptical of that because firstly, there seems to be a generic tendency for change to move, the drivenness to moving from the producer end to the buyer end. Think of Ford, which sees itself increasingly as an assembler and a retailer of car designs which other people will manufacture. But also, we've discovered, and Elizabeth Novis-Ailman and I just did an interesting PhD on this, in the same chain, there can be various forms of governance. So what appeared to be a tight distinction in Geraghty between buyer-driven and producer-driven chains is not nearly as tight as it seemed, but the question of drivenness and where the drivers come from is an important analytical component of any value chain analysis. Now, this we're coming to understand is a really critical part of governance, which is what rules do you have to follow and who defines those rules if you're going to participate in the chain. Some of those rules are corporate-driven, QCD, quality, cost, delivery. Toyota, you want to sell to delivery? You want to sell to Toyota, right? Used to be you could have 1,000 parts per million defects, then you could have 800 parts. Now there are no parts per million defects, right? And you deliver in small batches on time, and you show the capacity to innovate. You want to participate in any of the major chains which are driven intensively, there will be firm-specific standards which producers have to meet. Sometimes those standards are industry standards, and a lot of firms are wanting to move increasingly to industry standards because if they can set up industry standards, it enables them to pay off suppliers against each other. So what you found in the electronics industry moving to other industries is the quest by firms to have generic standards rather than firm-specific standards. Once you have generic standards, you can pay off suppliers against each other. Some of those standards are international or set by governance, which is food quality, EU farm to fork, and a variety of other standards. And these tend to be mandatory. What are not mandatory, but are important for producers because you feed into different market niches, are civil society standards, fair trade, organic, and a variety of other things. So just to summarize, once you have a division of labor and firms specialize in the core competences, once they outsource, particularly when they outsource in geographically dispersed regions, the capability to govern those chains, to coordinate those chains, and the power relations who determine what you have to do in order to perform becomes central to value chains. And this is really the Geraghty contribution, and the key component of that story are the standards. You know, what do you need to do in order to perform? This has major implications for developing countries, and I'll talk about this later on, because standards tend to be quite knowledge intensive, to have minimum scales in order to be accredited, and that tends to exclude small scale and poor producers around the world across a variety of chains. Okay, so this is really the standard article on global value chains. You want to read a single article, This is Giraffey, Humphrey, surgeon, really the flowering of the US Sussex group, which distinguishes between different degrees of coordination, stickiness, and they determine a series of relationships which are classically arm's length market driven, where price is the issue, where there's no stickiness between buyers and sellers. At the other extreme are transnational firms, where everything is internalized within the firm. And then you get a variety of intermediate relationships, modular, where the suppliers have quite a lot of capability, and there's a equivalence between first-tier suppliers and final users. Big concern in the automobile industry. They farmed out their sub-assemblies to a series of first-tier suppliers, and now the first-tier suppliers are beginning to rule the game. The same thing happening in a lot of electronics and computer firms as well. The rise of Foxconn, the Nova, and a variety of firms which used to be suppliers, which now begin to eat into the territory of the lead firms. And then you have where you have a different degrees of low competences, and it's a captive relationship and intermediate level of competences. And this is, if you Google anything on global value chains in Google Scholar, this is the paper which is now the cited paper, and it's actually very well done, and it really summarizes that Sussex group. Okay, so I'm almost finished the analytical issues, which is what it has to say about upgrading. And those two you will recognize in the economics of innovation, process and product upgrading. The big contribution of the value chain framework was the idea of functional upgrading, which is that it's not just getting better processes or better products, but it's moving your position within the chain. That is, that it's not just assembling, and I'll talk about this later on, it's also transforming manufacturers, perhaps designing, perhaps developing your own brand name as well. And the value chain framework has an important contribution around this issue of function upgrading. It also adds to this the Nokia story of chain upgrading, that after a while, when the chain becomes very competitive or you lose your competences, you move from rubber boots in the case of Nokia to, I think, machinery, to telephones, and now to who knows what. Okay, this is a new area which I'm not going to talk about at great length, but I think it's really underestimated in importance. International business literature and the hegemony of mainstream economics took ownership out of the story. And it was argued that there's it's a sort of Fukuyama type point. There's Frederick Winslow Taylor, there's only one best way. And the one best way is that all capitalist firms are the same, and all market relationships are the same. And we're now beginning to understand that that's absolutely not the case. Really interesting stuff coming out of Madagascar, which ran into trouble because of the military coup in selling into the US market. And there were a series of different types of ownership relationships in the clothing value chain from Madagascar, and how firms responded to the imposition of sanctions or the loss of privileges in the US market very much depended on who owned the firms. When we looked at Zambia, at suppliers into the copper value chain, marked differences in the supply chain practices of Japanese, Indian, and Western firms. And so I think we need to rethink the relationship of ownership, and embeddedness is not just an ownership story. It begins to interface with the GPN literature around the social nature of capital and ownership. So that's an underexplored one. And then the one which I've only seen one thing on, I marked a PhD thesis from Magister, which was absolutely fascinating. He looked at the clothing industry in Jordan and Egypt, both exporting $1 billion of clothes before the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, the Jordanian industry collapses, it loses $400 million of exports, the Egyptian industry doesn't. It's partly a story around embeddedness, but what he found in Jordan was that, yes, the capital was owned by Asian producers, they owned the buildings, they owned the technology, they owned the brand name, they owned the designs. You know what? Some of the supervisory labor came from Asia as well, but you know what? All the unskilled labor came from Asia as well. The value added in Jordan's clothing exports was virtually nothing, not even unskilled labor, nothing. And so this thesis, and I think it's a really significant piece of work, begins to tell us that it's not just a question around the mobility of capital, but it's also a question around the mobility of labor. And there's a lot of material in the value chain literature around migration flows within countries like China and India, but we also need to understand that the migration between countries is important as well, and that takes us out of economics back into political economy, which we have to understand the theorization of the social construction of labor. So we don't just have to understand the theorization of different types of capital and fractions of capital, mobility of capital. We have to refocus to understand the global division of labor and the distribution of returns, how labor forces are created. Okay, so that's a rush, and I'm going to just finish, Martin. I know I've overspoken. I keep going? So I've done two things here. I'll speed up. The first one was on, as were the origins of the value chain framework, where it comes from, the need to distinguish between heuristic approaches and analytical approaches. What I've now done is to talk about 6 analytical principles which help us understand questions of the distribution of value around the world, the capacity to upgrade innovation, and a variety of other topics. I now want to just briefly talk about dynamics of value chains. And this is a very useful one, which comes from what's his name? Oh, God. Will Milberg at the New School. And Will Milberg talks about the first thing in value chains is that you thin out. That's traditional industrial theory, right? Here's the value of a product. All of our thinking about industrial production is to build your value added, to deepen your value added. And the first thing you do when you start specializing core competences is that you thin out. And it's counterintuitive, has big implications for industrial policy. You may subsequently want to start building this, as China is doing, and to do the screens for the iPhone and various other things. But you no longer seek to command the total value added in a product. And this is a very big challenge for industrial policy in many countries, because it overturns thinking. If you go to UNIDA, you go to any of the texts on industrialization, it's all around building capabilities and deepening your value added in a product. And whoops, somebody says you want to participate in global value chains, first thing you do is you thin out your value added. So that's one dynamic. The second one is, and I hesitate to put this on board because it implies that there's only one best way and that you have to follow a particular route. But this is a route which has been followed successfully, I think, by firms like Samsung and many parts of the world. Remember, process upgrading, product upgrading, functional upgrading, and chain upgrading. You begin with original equipment assembly. You concentrate on process upgrading, and you don't just assemble, you begin to physically transform inputs as well. Once you've done that, you move into product upgrading, into original design, and if you're really good at that, you start putting your own brand name on it. Think of what Samsung did and how it got into that. And then you get to a while when actually some of the Taiwanese firms found you want to move out of that sector completely because it becomes very competitive. And the disembodied content of value added increases progressively along that chain. Now again, you don't have to do this. You can be born global if you like. You know that phrase. You can start here, but this seems to be in a route which many firms have followed. Martin, you did some really interesting work some years ago on how long it takes to develop capabilities in sectors. Is that right? I think the figure was 30 years, 35 years in many sectors. Yeah. Yeah, the hot day story. And this is essentially collapsing that story of 35 years into a picture which says you begin with process, move to product, move to functional, move to chain upgrading. You begin with assembly, you go to manufacture, you go to your design, you go to your brand, and then you get out completely. Now, remember I spoke about, I've got my development hat on partly, but only partly, and I'll talk about the non-development issue. This is the structure of household incomes in China 2004 and 2009. And really the key point, yes, there are changes. The key point is that the average household income in China is less than $10,000. And the figure in India is even more the case. Now, the northern economies, I believe, I know the US is said to be an exception, are essentially going to be locked into low rates of economic growth, if not stagnation. I know there are problems with China's economic growth rate, India's running into troubles, but in general, the dynamic parts of the global economy are now low and middle income countries. And the structure of their demand is very different to the demand in northern countries. It's not that these poor people don't aspire to the products that we consume, but they can't afford it. And what that means is that the types of products you sell into these markets are rather different. Quality becomes less important, organic standards become less important, labor standards become less important, and the whole role of standards in these value chains is diminishing, and that has important implications for developing countries because, remember, standards were a barrier to entry for many small-scale producers in meeting the requirements of large markets. So the big question we have to ask ourselves, and here from the development perspective, is what happens when the markets shift to the south, but it's a big question that the north has to ask as well. And the UK Technology Strategy Board is at this moment engaged someone to think about an innovation strategy for the UK for meeting the needs of consumers they know nothing about. And this has particular implications for Mittelstand type firms, middle-sized firms in the north. The large transnationals see this opportunity and think they can meet it, although they're all having trouble meeting in the bottom of the pyramid. The middle-sized firms need to do it, and they haven't yet got their mind right. Okay? So standards become less important, adverse effects on the environment, reduction in labor standards, degree of therefore. Okay, I think this is my final slide, which is that tendency of increasingly shifting value accretion out of the north to the developing countries, which has led to the development of China, is the outsourcing going to continue? And there are three reasons why I think we might want to question that. This has big implications for the global division of production, labor, value, and a variety of things. The first thing is 3D printing. At the moment, 3D printing is not really relevant in large-scale serial production. It's essentially a one-off or small batch production. There are people who believe, however, that 3D printing has enormous implications. It brings CAD-CAM to the same building, as opposed to the same electronic interface between buildings in different parts of the world. The second one is that energy costs are rising. Carlotta's written a lot on this and are likely to rise, and this reduces the incentive to the global fragmentation of production. And this is the one which I think is really, in my 2005 book on globalization, this was the one which I identified, and strange enough, I think it's the thing which I thought was most important in my book, or one of the most important things, and it's the one which no one has picked up. So it means that I'm deluded, doesn't it? But I think the security, the growing, what happens when somebody takes a bomb? I hope there's nobody in this room who I can, but why bother to put a bomb in an aeroplane when you can cause havoc by putting it in the check-in counter at Heathrow Airport? And the general attack on these global arteries of the massification of the homogenization of standards, it offends people around the world to have a particular set of values become hegemonic, that you should have pictures of nude women on posters advertising things all over the world. And there's an increasing rejection of the values in globalization, at the same time acceptance, but I think that this general attack on the arteries of global intercommunication is going to increase. So that's it really. Your stories around history, around why we should think of global value chains as an analytical framework, not a heuristic one. And I think that there are some important dynamic things happening there, which means that global value chains in the future might be rather different to the ones we've recorded in the last 30 or 40 years. Thanks, Michael.